Today, you'll discover the incredible story of Lady Eleanor Whitmore, a baron's daughter whose world crumbled in a single day, leading her on a journey that would transform her from nobility to legend. Prepare yourself for a tale of resilience, unexpected friendship, and the power of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest circumstances. Before we begin this amazing story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're listening to this story from. In the rolling hills of Virginia, 1852, the Whitmore estate stood as a testament to Southern aristocracy. Magnolia trees lined the grand driveway, their white blossoms perfuming the air with sweet elegance. The mansion itself, with its towering columns and wraparound porches, commanded respect from all who gazed upon it. This was the world Lady Eleanor Whitmore had known since birth, a world of silk gowns, afternoon teas, and servants who bowed at her every word. Eleanor, at 19, possessed the refined beauty expected of her station. Her auburn hair was always perfectly arranged, her posture impeccable, and her manners beyond reproach. She had been groomed since childhood to marry well, to continue the family's prestigious lineage. Yet beneath her polished exterior lay a curious mind and a compassionate heart that often troubled her governess. The Whitmore family had built their fortune on tobacco plantations, owning vast stretches of fertile land worked by dozens of enslaved people. Baron Charles Whitmore ruled his domain with an iron fist, believing firmly in the natural order that placed him at the top and others beneath him. His wife, Lady Margaret, shared his views completely, seeing their wealth and status as divine providence. On this particular morning, Eleanor stood on her bedroom balcony, watching the workers in the distant fields. The sun cast long shadows across the plantation, and she could hear the faint sound of singing drifting on the breeze. Among the field hands, she noticed a young man who worked differently from the others, while they moved in groups, talking and laughing. Despite their harsh circumstances, he worked alone, his movements deliberate and focused. Thomas had been born mute, unable to speak a single word, but his eyes held an intelligence that Eleanor found intriguing. She had noticed him before during her rare walks through the estate grounds, always keeping to himself, always watching. There was something about his quiet presence that drew her attention, though she couldn't quite understand why. The morning routine at Whitmore Manor followed the same pattern it had for decades. Eleanor would take breakfast in the sunroom, attend to her correspondence, practice piano, and receive instruction in French and literature. Her afternoons were reserved for needlework or painting, activities deemed appropriate for a lady of her standing. Yet today felt different somehow, as if the very air carried a sense of impending change. As Eleanor descended the grand staircase for breakfast, she noticed unusual activity in her father's study. Raised voices echoed through the heavy oak doors, and she caught glimpses of stern-faced men in dark suits entering and leaving. Her mother's face was pale and drawn, her usual composure cracked with worry lines that Eleanor had never seen before. The truth came crashing down during the midday meal. Baron Whitmore's face was ashen as he set down his fork with trembling hands. The creditors had finally come to collect, and the family's debts were far greater than anyone had imagined. Years of poor investments, failed crops, and extravagant spending had brought the once mighty Whitmore estate to the brink of financial ruin. "We've lost everything," her father announced, his voice barely above a whisper. "The house and the land, everything must be sold to satisfy our debts." Lady Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her throat as if she couldn't breathe. Eleanor felt the world spinning around her, unable to comprehend how their seemingly perfect life could crumble so completely, but the worst was yet to come. In a desperate attempt to save face and secure some form of future for his family, Baron Whitmore had made a deal with their largest creditor, a ruthless businessman named Cornelius Blackwood. The agreement was simple and devastating. Eleanor would work in Blackwood's household as an indentured servant for 7 years to help pay off the family debt. "And you cannot be serious, father," Eleanor protested, her voice shaking with disbelief. "I am your daughter, not some common servant to be traded away." But her father's eyes held no warmth, only the cold calculation of a man who had run out of options. The contract had already been signed, and Eleanor's fate was sealed. Within hours, everything changed. Eleanor's beautiful gowns were packed away, replaced with the rough cotton dress of a servant. Her jewelry, her books, her paintings, all were to be sold. She was allowed to keep only the most basic necessities. As she stood in her empty bedroom, looking at the bare walls where her portraits once hung, Eleanor felt as though she was watching someone else's life fall apart. The journey to Blackwood's estate took 2 days by carriage. Eleanor sat in silence, her hands folded in her lap, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity, even as her world collapsed around her. Her mother had wept when saying goodbye, but her father had simply nodded curtly, as if she were already a stranger to him. Blackwood Manor was a fortress of grey stone, imposing and cold. Unlike the warm elegance of her family home, this place felt hostile and unwelcoming. Cornelius Blackwood himself was a man in his 50s, with sharp features and calculating eyes that seemed to strip away any pretense of humanity. He looked at Eleanor not as a person, but as property he had acquired. "You'll work in the kitchens," he announced without preamble. "You'll rise at 4 in the morning and work until your duties are complete. You'll sleep in the servants' quarters and speak only when spoken to. Any attempt to contact your family or escape will result in severe consequences." His voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather rather than a young woman's future. The servants' quarters were a stark contrast to Eleanor's former bedroom. A narrow cot, a small wooden chest, and a single window that looked out onto the stable yard. This was now her entire world. The other servants, mostly older women, who had worked there for years, looked at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. They had heard about the fallen baron's daughter, and they weren't sure what to make of her. Eleanor's first day in the kitchens was a nightmare of burned hands, aching feet, and constant humiliation. She had never so much as boiled water before, and now she was expected to help prepare meals for an entire household. The head cook, a stern woman named Mrs. Patterson, showed no mercy for Eleanor's inexperience or former status. "Nobility don't mean nothing in my kitchen," Mrs. Patterson declared, watching Eleanor struggle to knead bread dough. "You'll learn to work like everyone else, or you'll go hungry." Eleanor's hands were soft and unused to manual labor, and by the end of the first day, they were raw and bleeding from the rough work. As night fell, and Eleanor collapsed onto her narrow cot, she stared at the ceiling and wondered how she would survive 7 years of this existence. The girl who had once worried about which dress to wear to dinner was now concerned with whether she would have enough strength to face another day of back-breaking labor. Weeks turned into months, and Eleanor's transformation was both physical and emotional. Her once soft hands became calloused and strong. Her posture changed from the rigid elegance of nobility to the practical stance of a working woman. The elaborate hairstyles of her past were replaced by a simple braid that kept her hair out of her face while she worked. Most significantly, the naive optimism of her sheltered upbringing gave way to a harder, more realistic understanding of the world. The other servants gradually began to accept her presence, though some remained resentful of what they saw as her privileged past. Eleanor learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of the servants' quarters. understanding that survival depended not just on hard work, but on building alliances and avoiding conflicts with those who could make her life even more difficult. It was during her 3rd month at Blackwood Manor that Eleanor first encountered Thomas again. She was carrying water from the well to the kitchen when she stumbled, her exhausted legs finally giving way under the weight of the heavy buckets. Water splashed everywhere, soaking her dress and creating a muddy mess in the courtyard. As she sat there, fighting back tears of frustration and exhaustion, she felt gentle hands helping her to her feet. Thomas had appeared as if from nowhere, his movements quick and efficient as he helped her gather the scattered buckets. His eyes met hers for a moment, and she saw something there that she hadn't encountered in months. Genuine kindness without expectation of anything in return. He gestured toward the well, indicating that he would help her refill the buckets, and Eleanor nodded gratefully. This became their routine. Thomas would appear whenever Eleanor was struggling with particularly heavy tasks, offering silent assistance before disappearing back to his own duties. He worked in the stables and the fields around Blackwood Manor, having been sold along with several other workers when a neighboring plantation went bankrupt. Like Eleanor, he was essentially property now, though his situation was far more permanent than her 7-year indenture. Eleanor began to look forward to these brief encounters. Thomas had a way of communicating without words that was more eloquent than most people's speeches. A raised eyebrow could convey concern, a slight smile could offer encouragement, and a gentle touch on her shoulder could provide comfort when the day's work seemed overwhelming. In a world where she felt invisible and forgotten, Thomas saw her as a person worthy of kindness. The relationship between Eleanor and Thomas didn't go unnoticed by the other servants. Some whispered that it was inappropriate for a former lady to associate with a mute field hand, while others found it touching that 2 outcasts had found solace in each other's company. Mrs. Patterson, the head cook, watched their interactions with a mixture of concern and understanding, remembering her own younger days when kindness was often the only thing that made life bearable. As autumn arrived, Eleanor had settled into a rhythm of survival. She had learned to anticipate Mrs. Patterson's demands, to avoid the areas where Blackwood himself might appear, and to find small moments of peace in the chaos of her new life. Her hands no longer bled from the rough work, and her body had adapted to the physical demands of her position, yet the emotional toll was harder to measure. Letters from her family were rare and brief. Her mother wrote occasionally, sharing news of their reduced circumstances and their attempts to rebuild their lives in a modest cottage in town. Her father never wrote at all, as if acknowledging Eleanor's existence would somehow make their fall from grace more real. These letters were both a blessing and a curse. They reminded her of the life she had lost while offering little hope, and for the future. It was during one particularly difficult evening, after Blackwood had berated her publicly for a minor mistake, that Thomas found Eleanor crying behind the stables. She was exhausted, humiliated, and beginning to lose hope that she would ever reclaim any semblance of the life she had once known. Thomas sat beside her in the gathering darkness, not trying to offer false comfort or empty reassurances, but simply being present in her moment of despair. In that silence, Eleanor realized that Thomas understood her situation in ways that others couldn't. He had never known privilege or comfort, yet he recognized the pain of being treated as less than human. His quiet strength became a source of inspiration for Eleanor, showing her that dignity could be maintained even in the most degrading circumstances. As winter approached, Eleanor began to notice changes in the household dynamics. Blackwood was becoming increasingly erratic and demanding, his business ventures apparently not going as well as he had hoped. The servants whispered about financial troubles and possible changes coming to the manor. Eleanor wondered if her own situation might change as well, though she had learned not to hope too much for improvements in her circumstances. The bond between Eleanor and Thomas continued to deepen, built on shared understanding rather than words. They had developed their own form of communication, a complex system of gestures and expressions that allowed them to share thoughts and feelings despite Thomas's inability to speak. Eleanor found herself looking forward to these silent conversations more than any social interaction she had enjoyed in her previous life. The turning point came on a bitter February morning, when Eleanor witnessed something that would change everything. She was cleaning the windows in Blackwood's study when she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Blackwood was meeting with a man she didn't recognize, discussing what sounded like illegal business dealings involving the transportation of people against their will. "The next shipment needs to be ready by month's end," the stranger was saying. "We have buyers waiting in Charleston, and they're paying premium prices for young, healthy workers." Blackwood nodded, shuffling through papers on his desk. "I have several candidates in mind. The mute boy from the stables would fetch a good price, and there's a girl in the kitchen who might interest certain buyers." Eleanor's heart stopped as she realized they were talking about selling Thomas, and possibly herself, to even worse circumstances. The illegal slave trade was still operating despite growing opposition, and Blackwood was apparently involved in trafficking people to buyers who cared nothing about existing contracts or legal protections. That evening, Eleanor found Thomas in the stables and tried desperately to communicate what she had overheard. Using gestures and drawings in the dirt, she managed to convey the danger they were both in. Thomas's expression grew grave as he understood the implications. They had perhaps 2 weeks before Blackwood would act on his plans. Thomas surprised Eleanor by producing a small piece of paper from his pocket. On it, he had drawn a detailed map showing routes through the countryside, marking safe houses and friendly contacts. Eleanor realized that Thomas had been planning an escape for some time, waiting for the right moment or perhaps the right companion. His muteness had been an advantage in some ways, allowing him to observe and listen without being noticed. The next few days were filled with careful preparation. Thomas had been saving small amounts of food and had hidden supplies in various locations around the property. Eleanor used her access to the main house to gather additional necessities: warm clothing, a small amount of money she found in forgotten corners, and most importantly, papers that might help them travel without being immediately identified as runaways. Their plan was simple but dangerous. They would leave during the new moon, when the darkness would provide cover for their escape. Thomas knew the countryside well from his work in the fields and had identified a route that would take them north toward Pennsylvania, where they might find help from abolitionists and others sympathetic to their cause. The night of their escape, Eleanor felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration, unlike anything she had ever experienced, as she slipped out of the servants' quarters, carrying only a small bundle of essentials. She was leaving behind not just Blackwood Manor, but her entire former identity. The frightened girl who had arrived here months ago was gone, replaced by a woman who was willing to risk everything for freedom. Thomas was waiting by the old oak tree at the edge of the property, just as they had planned. In the moonless night, his familiar silhouette was a beacon of hope and determination. Together, they set off across the fields, moving carefully to avoid the main roads where they might encounter patrols or other travelers who could report their presence. The first night of their journey was the longest of Eleanor's life. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness: the snap of a twig, the call of a night bird, the distant barking of dogs. Thomas led the way with sure steps, his knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable as they navigated through forests and across streams that would hide their scent from any pursuing hounds. As dawn approached, they took shelter in an abandoned a barn that Thomas had identified during his planning. Eleanor collapsed onto a pile of old hay, exhausted but exhilarated by their successful escape from Blackwood Manor. For the first time in months, she felt like she had some control over her own destiny. Thomas produced bread and dried meat from his pack, and they shared their first meal as free people. In the growing light, Eleanor could see the determination in Thomas's eyes, but also something else, a protective tenderness that made her realize how much their relationship had evolved during their time at the manor. They would need to travel only at night and rest during the day, avoiding main roads and populated areas where they might be recognized. The journey to Pennsylvania would take at least 2 weeks, assuming they encountered no major obstacles or pursuit. Eleanor knew that Blackwood would discover their absence quickly and would likely send men after them, making speed and stealth essential to their survival. As they settled in to rest during their first day of freedom, Eleanor reflected on how completely her life had changed. The pampered baron's daughter, who had once worried about social etiquette, was now a fugitive, dependent on her own courage and the loyalty of a mute farmhand who had become her closest friend and protector. Their journey north became a test of endurance, courage, and the growing bond between Eleanor and Thomas. Each night brought new challenges, river crossings that left them soaked and shivering, close encounters with suspicious travelers, and the constant fear that Blackwood's men were closing in behind them. Yet with each mile they traveled, Eleanor felt herself becoming stronger and more confident in her ability to survive. Thomas proved to be an invaluable guide and protector. His years of silent observation had taught him to read people and situations with remarkable accuracy. He could sense danger before Eleanor even noticed anything amiss, steering them away from potential threats with subtle gestures and alternative routes. His inability to speak had become a strength, forcing him to develop other senses and skills that now served them both. On their 8th night of travel, they encountered their first real test. A group of men on horseback passed near, their hiding spot, clearly searching for something or someone. Eleanor held her breath as torchlight flickered through the trees, and she felt Thomas's hand gently squeeze her shoulder, offering both comfort and a warning to remain absolutely still. The searchers moved on without discovering them, but the encounter reminded them both of how precarious their situation remained. As they continued north, they began to encounter people who offered help rather than threats. A Quaker family provided them with food and directions to the next safe house. An elderly freed slave gave them warmer clothing and shared stories of others who had made similar journeys to freedom. These encounters restored Eleanor's faith in human kindness and showed her a side of America she had never known existed. The transformation in Eleanor was remarkable. The soft-spoken lady who had once been afraid to voice her own opinions had become a woman capable of making life-or-death decisions. She learned to move silently through the forest, to read the signs that indicated safe passage, and to trust her instincts in ways she never had before. Thomas watched this transformation with obvious pride and affection, seeing in Eleanor the strength he had always believed she possessed. Their relationship deepened during the long nights of travel and the quiet days of hiding. Without words, Thomas had taught Eleanor more about courage, loyalty, and resilience than all her years of formal education had provided. In return, Eleanor's presence had given Thomas something he had never experienced: a true partnership, based on mutual respect and shared purpose. When they finally reached the outskirts of Philadelphia, both Eleanor and Thomas were different people than they had been when they left Virginia. They had survived not just the physical challenges of their escape, but the emotional journey of discovering who they truly were when stripped of all external definitions and expectations. Eleanor found work as a seamstress, her fine needlework skills finally serving a practical purpose. Thomas was hired by a sympathetic blacksmith who valued his skill and reliability over his ability to speak. They rented a small room above, a bakery, living simply but freely for the first time in their lives. The news of their successful escape eventually reached Virginia, where it became the stuff of local legend. Some said the Baron's daughter had been kidnapped by abolitionists. Others claimed she had gone mad and wandered into the wilderness. But those who knew the truth understood that Eleanor Whitmore had not been rescued. She had rescued herself, urged with the help of a mute farmhand who saw her worth when no one else did. Years later, Eleanor would establish a school for freed slaves and indentured servants, teaching them the skills they needed to build new lives in freedom. Thomas became her partner in this endeavor, his gentle nature and hard-won wisdom making him a beloved figure among their students. Together, they proved that true nobility came not from birth or wealth, but from the courage to stand up for what was right and the compassion to help others do the same. Their story became a testament to the power of human connection to transcend all barriers, social class, physical limitations, and the cruel circumstances that seemed designed to keep people apart. Eleanor and Thomas had found in each other not just love, but the strength to transform their lives and the lives of countless others who would follow in their footsteps toward freedom and dignity. The legend of the Baron's daughter and the mute farmhand spread throughout the region, inspiring others to believe that no situation was hopeless and no person was beyond redemption. Their escape had been just the beginning of a much larger story, one of building a life based on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the unshakable belief that every person deserved the chance to determine their own destiny. The years that followed were a testament to the power of love and determination. Eleanor and Thomas built their ranch from nothing, their hands working side by side to create something beautiful from the harsh wilderness. The mute farmhand, who had once been invisible in the shadows of Blackwood Manor, had become a respected rancher, his silence no longer a mark of servitude, but a sign of quiet strength and wisdom. Their first child, a daughter they named Hope, was born during a particularly harsh winter. As Eleanor held her newborn baby, she thought of her own mother, wondering if she would ever see her granddaughter. Thomas, now able to communicate through a combination of signs and written words that Eleanor had taught him, expressed his joy through tears that spoke louder than any words ever could. The ranch prospered beyond their wildest dreams. Thomas's intuitive understanding of the land and animals, combined with Eleanor's education and business acumen, created a partnership that seemed blessed by Providence itself. They employed former slaves and immigrants, creating a community where a person's worth was measured not by their birth, but by their character and hard work. Word of their success eventually reached the East Coast. Eleanor's story became legend among the abolitionist circles, the Baron's daughter who had chosen love over luxury, freedom over privilege. Newspapers wrote about the remarkable couple who had built an empire in the wilderness, though they never used their real names, respecting the privacy Eleanor had fought so hard to protect. One autumn day, nearly 15 years after their escape, a carriage arrived at their ranch. Eleanor was in the garden with Hope, now a spirited 14-year-old who had inherited her mother's intelligence and her father's gentle nature. The sight of the elegant carriage made Eleanor's heart race with a mixture of fear and anticipation. From the carriage stepped a woman Eleanor barely recognized. Her mother, Lady Margaret Blackwood, aged and frail, but with eyes that still held the same determination Eleanor remembered. Behind her came Eleanor's younger brother, William, now a man of 30 with kind eyes that reminded Eleanor of their father. The reunion was emotional beyond words. Lady Margaret wept as she embraced the daughter she thought she had lost forever, while William marveled at the strong, confident woman his sister had become. Thomas stood back respectfully, but Eleanor pulled him forward, her voice firm and proud as she introduced him as her husband. "Mother, this is Thomas, be my husband and the father of your granddaughter. He saved my life in more ways than one, and I would not trade our life together for all the wealth in the world." Lady Margaret looked at Thomas for a long moment, seeing not the mute farmhand she remembered, but a man whose eyes held depth, kindness, and an unmistakable love for her daughter. When Thomas offered her a small bouquet of wildflowers he had quickly gathered, she accepted them with tears in her eyes. "I was wrong," she whispered to Eleanor that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. "I thought I was protecting you by arranging that marriage, but I was only protecting our family's reputation. You found something far more valuable than what I could have given you." William brought news from the East. Their father had died 5 years earlier, leaving the estate to William, who had modernized their practices and freed all remaining indentured servants. The scandal of Eleanor's disappearance had eventually faded, replaced by whispers of admiration for the daughter who had chosen her own path. "There's something else," William said, pulling out a leather portfolio. "Father left this for you. He wrote it the year after you disappeared." Eleanor opened the letter with trembling hands. Her father's familiar handwriting filled the pages with words of love, regret, and understanding. He had realized, too late, that he had failed her as a father by not protecting her from Baron Ashford's cruelty. He had spent his remaining years working to change the laws that allowed such marriages to be forced, and he had left her a substantial inheritance, enough to secure her children's futures forever. Thomas, who had been quietly observing a reunion, approached Eleanor and gently took her hand. Through their private language of gestures and expressions, he asked if she was happy. Eleanor smiled through her tears and squeezed his hand. "I have everything I ever wanted," she said aloud, knowing her family would understand. "A man who loves me for who I am, children who will grow up free to choose their own paths, and a life built on truth and love rather than obligation and fear." Lady Margaret stayed for 3 months, long enough to truly know her granddaughter and to understand the life Eleanor had built. She watched Thomas work with the horses, saw how the ranch hands respected him, and witnessed the quiet communication between her daughter and son-in-law that spoke of a deep, abiding love. On the day of her departure, Lady Margaret pulled Thomas aside. Though he could not speak, she saw in his eyes the same protective love she had once seen in her own husband's gaze. "Thank you," she said simply, "for giving my daughter the life I could not." Thomas nodded and handed her a small wooden carving he had made, a horse running free across an open plain. Lady Margaret understood the symbolism and treasured it for the rest of her days. As the years passed, Eleanor and Thomas's ranch became a symbol of hope and possibility. Their children, Hope, followed by twin boys they named Freedom and Justice, grew up understanding that their parents' love story was one of courage, sacrifice, and the belief that true love could overcome any obstacle. Eleanor often stood on the hill overlooking their land, remembering the terrified girl who had once faced a life of misery in Baron Ashford's house. That girl had found her voice, her strength, and her purpose through the love of a man who had never needed words to show her what she was worth. Thomas would join her on these evening walks, and together they would watch their children play in the fields they had built with their own hands. In the silence they shared, there was more communication than in all the empty words Eleanor had heard in her father's house. Their love story became legend, passed down through generations as proof that sometimes the greatest treasures are found not in the places we expect, but in the hearts of those who see our true worth. When the world has forgotten it,